Hi everyone. Let me just share my screen and then we can get started. Thank you for joining us today. There we go. Brilliant. So let's dive in. Many companies face significant water impacts and dependencies from suppliers deep within their value chains. And many of these suppliers, companies don't have direct contracts with these suppliers. So effectively, addressing these impacts and dependencies is critical for creating business resilience and also increasing and is increasingly becoming an expectation of corporate stakeholders. So how do we start to broaden our procurement strategies to tackle these water impacts and dependencies within our value chains more effectively? I'm Rylan from WWF, and along with my colleague Sarah from AstraZeneca and John from the Embedding project, over the next hour, we hope to what we're going to attempt to do is highlight this challenge that is faced by companies with respect to addressing water impacts deeper within their value chains. We're then going to introduce a framework that we believe can offer a starting point to help to explore alternative pathways of collaboration with suppliers on water through procurement practices. And as we do that, we're going to try and find some time to discuss the content through a combination of fireside chats with the different speakers, but then also to respond to any questions that you might have. So let's dive in. And before we get too deep into the role of that procurement can play in addressing these challenges, I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page with the respect to the problem that we're actually talking about today. So let's start with what is water stewardship and how is this different from water management? For many companies, action on water is typically confined to water that is used within their operational boundaries. And this is what we typically refer to as water management. However, water has a life before and after um, the site experiences and uses water. And so, water stewardship can be thought of expanding the context in which a site is operating or within a company is operating to start to understand how water is impacted and surrounds the particular site. And so, as an example, what we can think of is how are water, so the levels of ambient water quality levels entering a facility start to impact how that facility is actually reliant on water quality. As for a definition of water stewardship within this community, we typically sort of look to the Alliance for Water Stewardship as a sort of common definition of what water stewardship is. Now, water is also multidimensional. Open any company sustainability report, and if water is discussed in there, it's most likely through the lenses of either quality or quantity. But water has other dimensions to it. So, access to water sanitation and hygiene or WASH, freshwater biodiversity, and water governance. And so, while not all of these issues and these dimensions of water might be strategically material to a company, for some others might be much more, some of these other ones might be more impactful and material than just water quantity and quality. So, for example, if there are poor levels of WASH provision in the communities in which employees live, absenteeism as a result of waterborne illness may be a larger impact on production um, rather than simply just the water that a facility uses. Water is also local. The different dimensions of water that I just walked through also manifest very differently across geographies. Meaning, if we took four random operational facilities or three operational facilities, each of these locations for each of these suppliers, the profile of these different sort of dimensions of water would look very different. So again, water scarcity may be a more material issue and challenge for some suppliers, whereas for others, it may be something like water quality. Now, water impacts for companies and these impacts and dependencies vary across the value chain. However, typically, what we find is as we go deeper in the value chain, so the higher the impacts and dependencies on water become. Contrast this with what we typically see in terms of a company's ability to influence and control their environmental actions, and in this case, water, typically diminishes the deeper you go into a value chain. Again, open any company sustainability report, and if water is discussed or if there's action being taken on water, this is largely restricted to a small part of the value chain. And it's not surprising that this is the case because the ability of a company to influence and control the actions it is taking with suppliers in, say, tiers 1 and 2 is often greatest in these places that they are taking action. However, this is typically, again, not where the largest and most material impacts and both dependencies on water are found. And so the question becomes, how can companies begin to effectively expand this action on water deeper into their value chain in order to tackle these larger sources of impacts and dependencies? And secondly, what role can procurement play in supporting these efforts? So, as a quick summary of these key points that I've just kind of run through, water challenges are multidimensional, local, and unique. So, again, water is not just water quantity, it's not just water quality. There are many different dimensions to this, and they manifest very differently in different locations. Water is, and the most material impacts on water often lie deeper within value chains beyond where a company typically has the most ability to influence and control action. And procurement has a role to play in addressing these water impacts. So hopefully that starts to set the scene for what we're going to talk about. And this is kind of in the spirit of highlighting this challenge. And we're going to then move into a section where we kind of start to introduce that, some solutions to that. But before I do that, I want to kind of just have a pause and bring in Sarah into this conversation as a corporate and someone who's looking at borders. So, Sarah, if you could maybe just quickly give us a quick introduction to yourself, and then I've got a few questions for you.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Great to be here. My name's Sarah Argoud. I sit within our global sustainability team under our environmental protections pillar of our wider sustainability strategy. And my role specifically is focused on our natural resources material focus area. So that's going to include things like circularity, biodiversity, responsible sourcing, and then water stewardship, which is what brings me here today.
Great, thanks, Sarah. So let's kick off with an easy one. Why is water so strategic for AstraZeneca then, as a pharmaceutical company?
Yeah. So, firstly, within the pharmaceutical sector, as you mentioned, AstraZeneca is a big player there. Our water use generally is not quite as high compared to other sectors. So, maybe like food and bev or agriculture. We did a risk assessment together a couple years back, and that really highlighted that water quality is where it's most strategically relevant for our sector. Manufacturing medicines requires a really consistent supply of high quality water. So again, maybe not so much the volume, but we need to make sure that it's fit for our use. And then specifically at AstraZeneca, we have a really highly dynamic and complex global supply chain that we depend on to maintain our supply for patients. And so that kind of makes, again, that kind of dependence on water further away from where we can kind of have the most control. So when it comes to managing our water impacts and dependencies, we do know that partnership across our supply chain is quite important.
Great. So in that kind of introduction, I talked about kind of water impacts and dependencies, sort of looking different across the value chain. So first of all, does that resonate with you for a company like AstraZeneca? And if it does, how does it start to influence sort of how AstraZeneca starts to plan the actions that it's going to be taking on water?
So as a pharmaceutical company, we tend to follow a science-led approach to everything that we do, and building our understanding of our impacts and dependencies kind of within our product portfolio when it comes to various environmental factors, including water. That's no exception here. So we have a pretty mature life cycle assessment program, and that's a really good place to start to just identify different hotspots across our entire value chain. And we want to make sure that we're using that information to prioritize our efforts so that we're making a meaningful difference, including those that are within our supply chain. So I have a couple examples that I'd like to share. So first, when it comes to quantity of water from our LCA life cycle assessment program, we do know that for the majority of our products, a good chunk of our footprint is within the manufacture of our API. As a pharmaceutical company, we're not quite as dependent on kind of the agricultural products. So that's where we might be a little bit more rare. But yes, so that being in mind, we focus our efforts on two fronts. So first, we design out the dependency on water as much as we possibly can during process development. We don't necessarily always know where we're going to be manufacturing these products, so it's especially important thinking about kind of how much variability on where they'll end up being manufactured there is. So to drive that, we have something called a Product Sustainability Index program that packages things quite nicely together across lots of different aspects. So in general, we try and bring our water efforts kind of within our carbon strategy, energy. We try and bring it all together. So this Product Sustainability Index is a scoring mechanism across various different factors that the bench scientists can control, and it brings a little healthy competition. And then we also have action plans coming out of that kind of drive continuous improvement across various aspects of water. And then the other way that we have really prioritized our engagement thus far is with our tier 1 suppliers. Again, the ones that are making our APIs are that pretty large chunk of the footprint that we've identified thus far. So we work with them to share our best practices and learnings from our own efficiency efforts within our sites. So then also want to kind of mention, again, that water quality aspect is quite material for us. And we know that we do have the risk of impacts from pharmaceuticals in the environment. So that's, again, one that's a bigger risk more widely across our sector. So for those of you who aren't as familiar, pharmaceuticals entering the environment is an unavoidable result of delivering the life-changing medicines that we make for our patients. Some of these medicines will only work if they're designed to persist, so they're excreted after patient use or just kind of remain in the environment. And while this risk is generally low based on our current scientific understanding, we do recognize that it's quite important to keep a very close eye on, especially as we aim to reach more patients worldwide, again, across our sector. So patient use is that primary way that our active ingredients enter the environment. And although we've found generally that discharge from our manufacturing, whether in our supply chain or within our own sites, is a minimal contributor to this risk globally, it can pose that local intermittent risk that could be felt by the environment, the ecosystems kind of that are most close in proximity to the sites where the APIs are being manufactured. So we want to make sure that we're taking action where we have the most control. And so the way our program works, it gets quite heavy on the science, so bear with me. I'll try and explain a little bit. We do an environmental risk assessment where every product kind of gets assessed, and we establish a limit of concentration, kind of a target that we say we don't want to exceed when it comes to the discharges happening from those individual manufacturing sites. takes lots of that kind of local context into account. And then to be kind of keep us honest and be additionally kind of extra transparent, we set a target, one for our supplier sites and one for our own sites, just to account for kind of the changeover in suppliers and the education that's involved to kind of follow this process, because there is some upskilling needed there. But we kind of aggregate the results of all of the different kind of discharge measures that we gather over each year, and then we report our progress in our sustainability report. So if anybody's interested in learning more, we really are very proud of our transparency and kind of what we've been able to do in partnership with suppliers to kind of educate more widely about this risk. So everything's on our website at AstraZeneca.com if you want to check it out. So these are kind of the primary ways where we've identified water impacts and dependencies and engaged with our supply chain to address them. But again, kind of partnering with you guys and building this guide, we're really eager to continue the journey and widen kind of our view and find where else we can engage and have a more holistic approach moving forward.
Cool. Thank you very much, Sarah. Again, I'd encourage people to kind of, if you've got questions as we're going through this content, please start throwing them into the Q&A box. And as we get to the kind of more general Q&A, we can start looking at those as well. Okay, so we've heard from Sarah, and by no means, this is not just a pharmaceutical sector sort of challenge. This is across all sectors. So now that we've started to highlight this potential challenge facing companies, how do we start addressing what's the solution space look like to start accessing and addressing these large impacts later on, or sort of deeper within the supply chain, especially for a resource like water, which is so localized and multidimensional. So much of what I'm going to walk through in the next few slides is contained within this paper that we released last year. There's a QR code up on the screen, so if you hold your smartphone up to that with the camera, you should be able to get the link, and we can also try to stick it in the chat at some point. But really, this paper was developed in response to this challenge of how to address these large water impacts and dependencies in the value chain in a more collaborative way with suppliers. And we fundamentally believe that procurement represents an opportunity for companies to access and to take action, and to kind of sort of offer a bit of a solution to this challenge. Now, before I kind of just go on, I will just flag that it's worth noting that the audience that this paper was written for is primarily not those in procurement functions, but those within companies who were within sustainability teams working on the topic of water. So why are we discussing this then on this webinar? Well, those sustainability teams are often responsible for setting that strategic approach and framing for water for a company. And this is a framework that we put out in 2021, which is intended to help those sustainability teams systematically think through how water impacts and dependencies manifest across their value chain, and ensure that localness and that those multi-dimensions of water are fully considered in that strategic process. But in many cases, as we've discussed, these impacts and going through a process like this are going to start highlighting that these impacts and dependencies lie deeper within the value chain. And so often procurement becomes a very powerful mechanism and a strategic response that companies can start to use in order to deliver against these strategies. And as such, we wanted to start equipping these sustainability teams with not only some initial insights into sustainable procurement practices, but also generally start to equip them with a framework that they can start using to more proactively engage procurement teams in becoming or finding more integrated and aligned ways to to sort of bridge the procurement practices in service of these more strategic corporate responses to water. So hopefully by now we're all on the same page that with water being so local and all these multi-dimensions to water, that there's no one size fits all to engage and collaborate with suppliers. So at the core of this paper is a framework of pathways, and they're intended to spark some more creative solutions that go beyond simply just mandating efficiency improvements from suppliers. So how have we done this? Well, we've identified 5 different categories of potential pathways in which there are different sort of options in which we can start to use to engage and collaborate with our suppliers. Now, there's a lot of content within each of these categories and pathways within the paper, but to give you a flavor of what you can find in that paper, we've started to break those different categories down into a series of different tables. And in these tables, you can find the name of each pathway, a brief description, under what contractual circumstances it is best deployed, and also where within the value chain it's could be best deployed, and also the benefits of these different pathways, not only for water resources, but also for the company and also the supplier. And so again, here I'm not going to go through every single one of these, but what I'm hoping that this starts to illustrate is that it starts to equip sustainability teams with and start to help them come up with creative ideas on how they can start to look at different forms of solutions, different forms of collaborations that could be deployed through procurement related activities as part of a wider strategic approach to water. So again, trying to enable them to come to procurement teams to start that conversation at a different level, rather than just, can we just mandate efficiencies from our tier 1 suppliers, for instance? How do we start accessing and encouraging and enabling and equipping our tier 1 suppliers to engage their tier 2 suppliers, to engage their tier 3 suppliers? What other mechanisms can we informally support tier 2s, 3 and 4 suppliers in order to start having a bigger impact on reducing our water use, but also start to reduce and improve our dependencies on water? So in a nutshell, that's what you're going to find in the paper, and this is really at the core of what we believe is part of that solution package. And in a moment, we're going to hear from John, who's going to kind of look a little bit, sort of take a bigger step back in terms of putting this into context of the procurement cycle. But before that, I want to go back to Sarah, because Sarah has been a supporter of this work. So Sarah, why did AstraZeneca support this work with WWF and the embedding project, and kind of what benefits could it offer a company like AstraZeneca?
So again, kind of for those of you who are maybe less informed on kind of the ins and outs of what's going on with most sustainability professionals today, there's quite an effort going on to bring that view of kind of what's across those, especially finding those unknowns further back within your supply chain. There's a lot more external pressure to identify what that looks like, whether it's even modern slavery, kind of human rights impacts, or just owning the accountability as a large brand is becoming more and more significant. So we know that we need to lean into those. One way that we're doing that is through adoption of the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, or TNFD. And personally, I'm quite excited to kind of jump into that. And there's a framework called the LEAP framework, which I think will be quite helpful in supporting kind of identifying those unknowns. So the LEAP framework stands for locate, evaluate, assess, and plan. And ultimately what it's looking for all brands to do, and especially one like ours where those dependencies on nature, other than water being a pretty clear one, it's not as obvious. We're not going right back to farms where it's not always clear what natural ingredients that are going to be those kind of heavy dependent on those wider ecosystems. It's not super obvious to us, and not one that we've really leaned into as much as maybe some other sectors. So taking that structured approach and deepening our knowledge of water impacts and dependencies globally is the journey that we're on. And this guide I see as one that will help us be prepared with more practical ways to engage across our supply chain most effectively as we progress.
Great, thank you. Now, with a lot of these kind of resources, certainly in the way in which we try and curate some of these, Sarah, like we try and make these as practical as possible, but there is always this bridge between practice and implementation. And so this is by no means sort of perfect. But what kind of challenges could you sort of expect in implementing some of the elements of this framework from this resource?
Yeah, so hopefully we're helping kind of paint the picture of just how local water is and how many considerations that you have to take. So what we're hoping to do within AstraZeneca is, again, really be super clear and super consistent and leverage the learning that we've already had in the journey we've already been on. So I can absolutely share some of our takeaways from our work on climate, just to give some context. So for those who aren't aware of our Scope 3 target, we're looking to reduce our absolute Scope 3 GHG emissions. And then to do that, we've leveraged frameworks like the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And so again, kind of as Rylan described, that working with your tier 1 suppliers, but then to kind of drive action backward. So that's where setting those science-based targets is a really effective way that's driven climate action. So how can we use this guide to maybe inform kind of future things that we've done? And then the other aspect that I think is incredibly important to help that kind of practical side really come through is scaling more effectively by unifying as kind of the larger brands within sectors and speaking with one voice. And what I was quite excited to see is when we did this Sustainable Markets Initiative Health Systems Task Force, which again is another mouthful. The aim there was for several of the CEOs from within our sector to kind of join hands and agree on some key targets, at least like a minimum standard of targets, to publish and kind of share widely across our supply chain to kind of set that expectation to attempt to deliver net zero healthcare. And what we also included in there was kind of a set of expectations on water. And so now I think it's up to us kind of within the sector, but focused on water, to kind of come together and define exactly what that is so that we can help make it clear how companies can engage, how they can drive this more practically within their tier 1 suppliers and kind of drive that action back as well.
Cool. Thank you very much, Sarah. I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit because there's a question that's come up, which I think is worth kind of just bringing into this conversation a little bit here. So the question is, like, is water a new topic for AstraZeneca? And a lot of what we're talking about, you're shaking your head already. A lot of what we're talking about and addressing these larger impacts, I mean, certainly from my perspective, it's I would class this as kind of like a sort of more advanced kind of action on water, because in many cases, when companies start their kind of journey on water, and I've already kind of flagged it as you open many sustainability reports and water action is confined to operations, and I don't think that's necessarily an accident because again, the control and influence is greatest in those places. So again, if you could maybe just quickly kind of just say answer that kind of question, like kind of hinting at the answer already, but is kind of water a new topic for AstraZeneca? Yeah.
Yeah, so definitely not new, but I think like any company, there's always opportunities to kind of build on where you've been. So regardless of kind of how long you've been at it, so to speak, I think a lot of new tools are emerging. A lot of kind of widened understanding, I think, is helping simplify things a little bit. And I think ultimately it's all about taking the steps to understand from a high level, but not to get paralyzed by all of the different data sources. And is it this risk filter, or is it, that risk indicator that I use? Like, really just kind of look really widely about where these risks are starting to emerge, and then kind of just start to engage. It's as simple as, talking to those local stakeholders about what those challenges might be, and just kind of following the learnings as you go.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sarah. Okay, at this point, I kind of want to bring John into the mix here from the Embedding project, just to kind of just take us a little bit more of a step back and look at kind of the general sort of play of sustainable procurement, and then start to kind of help us kind of put a lot of this sort of more specific content into context. So, John, over to you.
Thanks, Rylan. So yeah, thanks very much everyone for having me as well today. The Embedding project, first of all, we're a global public benefit research project. So what we do as an organization is support companies and public authorities to embed social and environmental factors across their sort of operations and decision making. So I've been working with the Embedding project for a few years now, and we do that by creating sort of guides, assessments, and different tools in different aspects of sustainability. And one of them happens to be on procurement. So we've been working for the last couple of years on that side of things. So we partnered with a number of our own member organizations within the Embedding project to research pretty vigorously a number of resources, as well as interviewing chief procurement officers, category managers, and others to come up with what we thought is a well sort of documented framework for sustainable procurement. This focuses on two aspects. One is the inner ring, which really is going through the typical procurement cycle of sort of plan, select, award, and manage. And then the other aspect is the outer ring, which is that more kind of foundational and systemic work that an organization needs to do to set some of those deeper procurement aspects that we've heard of there from Sarah. So the idea really is, as Rylan mentioned, trying to really give a framework for procurement for those that are sort of either new to the topic or want to improve their work on the topic. So if I invite you to sort of visit our page and the links that we'll share, and if you go onto the page, you'll see each of those segments has its own page within that, and there's a number of resources around tips and hints and sort of guidance, as well as examples and resources that we've curated quite carefully as well, showing other links to different aspects. So that's one example there on contract management. We also, as an organization, produce issue snapshots. So these are sort of slight deeper dives into different topics. And you'll notice here as well that water is one of them. So as well as other sustainability aspects, if you want to deepen your understanding, not just on procurement, but on water issues, then I also invite you to visit that page. So with that in mind, then we collaborated with WWF and AstraZeneca on the water stewardship guide that Rylan mentioned, supporting that kind of framework of activities that a typical procurer might need to go through to one, embed sustainability, but then particularly obviously with that water focus in mind. So we use that inner wheel, the inner part of the cycle that I showed you, to really kind of set some of those aspects around water stewardship. So the first part, for example, is the planning stage, and this is the sort of the really foundational stage for addressing any sustainability topic, including water. And this is one of the stages that we spent probably the most time with our different organizations in developing the procurement wheel. You'll see here then the guide goes deeper into this, but there's aspects around sort of preparation, so sort of identifying your needs, aims and objectives around water stewardship, exploring the capacity and the other aspects around the market, pre-qualifying suppliers, so we're looking to how you can screen for water sustainability within supply chains, and then also then starting to build those specifications for sustainability. So using different water stewardship benchmarks and other standards and other types of approaches, really trying to sort of set that sustainability specification. The next stage then, as part of the procurement wheel, is the select stage. So at this stage then, as procurers will know, it's around that kind of identifying and partnering with suppliers who might align with the procurement goals. And again, in this case, around water stewardship. So you're looking at defining what those water stewardship criteria might be in your supplier selection when you're going out to tender or requesting proposals. And then that evaluation and validation. So we touch upon some of those aspects that you might want to include for supplier water stewardship compliance. Then we move on to the award section. So within the guide, then we cover some of those decision-making aspects for awarding contracts and kind of establishing those water stewardship goals with suppliers when you're negotiating and awarding those contracts. So it's about sort of integrating those sort of targets in contract negotiations, doing it in a transparent and kind of open way. And then when it comes to the contract management, then also kind of enforcing some of those guidelines, KPIs, incentives, or other kind of accountability measures that you might include. And then finally, we go on to the management side of things. So an important part of the process is that kind of ongoing monitoring improvement. So there's some hints and tips and links there in terms of managing performance. So how do you track, engage, and train your suppliers ongoing for water performance improvement? How do you support suppliers? One key thing there as well, much of the research that we did, both in terms of water, but also just generally on sustainability, is around, it's about the carrot as well as the stick. So especially when we're talking about sort of those suppliers deeper in those tiers. So how do you provide those resources and kind of collaborative forums that suppliers can benefit from as well? There's bits about managing logistics, so integrating that kind of water efficiency and other aspects into your own logistics planning and supply chains. And that also links then into stewarding some of the assets that you're procuring. And then finally, the adapt part then just touches upon some of those audits and metrics and other ways that we can make sure that we're monitoring and aligning with that kind of ongoing improvement of water in our supply chain. So the guide really, it locks in very much to the work that we've done as the embedding project on this procurement wheel. And as I say, we'll focus mainly on a typical procurement cycle and that kind of middle part of the wheel. But if you go into the website and the link I've left in the resources there, you'll also see our wider supply chain and value chain work we've done as well. So there'll be other aspects in there for you to have a look at.
Excellent. Thanks, John. And yeah, again, just to put that into context, we're going to have a bit of a chat now with John. But again, just to flag that, I would say that, and I think you'd agree with me, John, like I think the embedding project's sort of expertise is kind of more on that kind of process perspective on sort of procurement. Also, this is one element of sustainability, corporate sustainability, that you've kind of looked at and unpacked in your procurement guide, and we kind of, as WWF and AstraZeneca, look to partner with the embedding project in terms of helping to put that more specific water sort of solution package, as it were, into the context of this. So what you'll see in the guide is you will see it's more water focused, but there is a sort of appendice at the back, which is a bit of a summary of what John's spoken about, but also a bit of a summary as to what you can find in the more standalone sort of procurement guide that the Embedding project have produced. So John, are there any other considerations that are kind of important when we consider how we can better embed water stewardship into procurement?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we've touched upon within the guide, as I mentioned, is that sort of more of a typical procurement process for a particular product or service or sector. As I touched upon earlier in the presentation, there's what we call the outer ring, so some of that foundational work. And I think some of those pathways would also be very important for any organization to begin to first of all understand the water stewardship elements in their supply chain. And Sarah mentioned some of this work they've been undertaking around risk and other elements. And this is something that we also include within our procurement wheel. So there's resources and other advice and tools around mapping the value chain, assessing context, evaluating risk, and other aspects around that kind of deep understanding. There's also parts in there about setting strategy. So how are you prioritizing sustainability, and then within that water stewardship perhaps, and also how are you committing to that publicly as an organization. So there's which then feeds into your supply chain and the value chains that you're working with. So there's a number of different pathways on that outer wheel that I would also recommend that organizations can take a look at from that perspective. We also touch upon internal and external collaborations and improvements. So everything from kind of upskilling staff and sort of clarifying the roles and positions and policies internally to that external collaboration where you're maybe supporting innovation in supply chains, helping to shape industry norms around different sustainability topics, and even engaging in advocacy as an organization to really support some of these ambitions as well. So there's a whole suite of activities, and I'm sure Sarah and those others in the call are well aware of all the things that can be done. So we've developed this procurement wheel in collaboration with other guides, such as the water guide, to really allow you to sort of dip into some of those elements when you need to and see some of those pathways.
Brilliant. What are some of the other key practices that sort of certainly procurement teams and also sustainability teams can think about in terms of boosting that sort of supplier collaboration more generally, but also specifically with respect to water?
I think from the conversations we had with our procurement colleagues in different organizations, and including also the Sustainable Procurement Pledge colleagues that we validated this wheel with, a lot of the advice we had was around supplier engagement, and there's probably maybe two or three main things kind of stuck out for me. One was the early engagement, so just in that early understanding stage or in the planning stage of a particular procurement, it's to really look at the possibilities for either capacity building, training, or kind of just onboarding suppliers with your own commitments, and before you even get to that point of procurement. At the contracting stage, there would be elements around kind of those negotiations for sort of water responsibility in contracts, and in particular then making sure that those contracts are being managed and supplier performance is being managed in a way that's both collaborative and supporting kind of proactive, kind of positive engagement, as well as sort of corrective actions that can be supported as well. So this supplier engagement really takes place at all parts of the process. But I'd say the general consensus from a lot of the talks we have was the earlier the better, and then also the more positive those engagements are in terms of contract management, the better.
Okay, thanks, John. Right, you've heard from us. So it's now over to you all. So I would encourage you to use the chat or the Q&A function just to kind of throw any sort of questions that you do have for any of the speakers. And we'll try to get to as many of those as possible. So again, we got about 10 minutes or so of Q&A. So maybe while we're waiting for kind of people just to kind of sort of let that sort of process a little bit and do some typing. Maybe Sarah, in a kind of a large company like AstraZeneca, what's been your experience in terms of making the business case for stewardship, like especially across the whole supply chain? Because especially when you've got, visibility of data is fairly limited, and it's easier to create the business case to invest in your own assets as opposed to others. Yeah, could you just give us a little bit of an insight on that as we wait for some questions to come through?
Yeah, so I think, again, it's all about following those learnings and not getting stuck by the lack of data that might be available on kind of the point that you're on in your journey. So one of the resources that you and I put together recently, just to kind of paint the picture of the way that I've brought one thing in, we pulled together data kind of mapping all the way back to the tier N, kind of where we're sourcing directly from nature, and where those water risks were more great than we realized for two different commodities. So we looked at palladium and palm oil, which again, as a pharmaceutical company, you don't necessarily know exactly where those different aspects are within your supply chain. But we could use kind of globally available data sets and identify where it might be most likely that we're dependent on water, which places around the world, and kind of have brought that back. Again, not to say that we're super far along on our journey yet, but it's these ways to kind of bring things in and just start to paint the picture of kind of the steps that you need to take even to gather that data and drive more action. So lots of kind of just parallel efforts showing the ways that we need to think more widely about water beyond just our facility walls. So it's not easy. So the more that you can kind of help paint the picture with just some key pilots or key examples like that, that really helps people start to conceptualize what you're really asking them to do, because it is quite a large change management type of mindset that you need to drive.
Cool. Again, Q&A, send those questions through. Obviously, we're doing a great job because it's not much coming through. But John, maybe I'll kind of just come back to you on something in terms of what is, so I posed the question to Sarah earlier about kind of implementation challenges of a framework like set out in the paper, but from a step back from what do you see as some of those major challenges that you've seen through those discussions that you've had in developing the procurement wheel in terms of applying certainly water stewardship, but maybe even just more generally sustainability into procurement, and how can we start to overcome those?
I think one of the major challenges in any sector or any of these cross-cutting kind of sustainability issues would be that kind of transparency and traceability, whether that's topics on human rights, topics on other sustainability concerns, and obviously water. Obviously, the sort of complexity of many different supply chains can make this a really difficult issue, and this is very much the case seemingly with water as well, being such a kind of diverse and quite localized issue in many cases too. It can be even more tricky to try to understand those supply chains that we're working within for water. So that would certainly be a major challenge. Another one would also be related to that, perhaps, is the diversity perhaps of regulations and standards around water. And that includes some of the maybe even sort of data management or other things that we can start to standardize slightly more with other environmental metrics that we're still maybe trying to do with water. So I think from a procurement perspective, and as a procurer, trying to implement this, it's a lot to try to take on board and try to deal with in terms of, as Sarah said, their data and other aspects that they have to try to gather. So I think that would definitely be a major challenge, is that complexity and variation of the system that we're working within.
Cool. Yeah, I think from my perspective, and certainly when I'm dealing with and talking to companies, I think this, as soon as you start talking about, like, how water is so local and it changes from place to place, and it's got so many multiple dimensions to it, and kind of, procurement teams just wrap their head around sort of like carbon. Now they're like, whoa, now you want to, look at something even more complex. I think for me, if you think about it as a funnel, and if you can start to kind of funnel down and focus in on those more strategic and material issues and dimensions of water across the value chain, because again, certainly from a WWF perspective, we're not looking for action on every single element of water. We're looking for action on like the most sort of material sources of impact. And so there's a strategic kind of, it's linked to that business case kind of question, Sarah. It's like there is a case to be made to say certain things we're not going to look at within our kind of water strategy, and we need to kind of focus in on those sort of priority areas. So we've got a question in here, and maybe we'll kind of wrap up with this one. So with all the sort of focus on carbon emissions, are you, and I'm assuming that's Sarah, finding it challenging to get focus and support on water-related topics? And if you are, how are you working to overcome those?
Yeah, so carbon emissions are definitely sometimes an outsized topic, but I find this to actually be an opportunity. One example is, if we're going out and collecting all of this Scope 3 data, it's a massive opportunity to kind of tack on water into that discussion and start to identify a little bit more context of, where those hotspots of water use exist within our tier 1 suppliers, just for example. And those co-benefits of energy, at least within our sector, all the water purification is highly energy intensive. So there's an opportunity to kind of start to look at, hey, all these savings that you want from an energy and carbon perspective, if you focus in on water, then you kind of have, again, those maximized co-benefits. So I think within every sector, there's probably lots of opportunities like that, where it doesn't have to be a competing priority. And it's just helping people kind of look at things a little bit differently, because water is so intertwined across all of these different aspects of use, so that more circular approach can often also include water.
Okay. There's another Q&A from Kirsten about kind of investors. So that's a whole other kind of big topic, and I want to start kind of wrapping us up, but kind of I'll just quickly kind of give my kind of 2 cents on that one. And I think again, from my perspective and from our perspective, I think I think there's an element of investor education that's certainly needed, and certainly not so much prompting companies, and we we're talking about this just before this call, to we have to have consistency in terms of disclosure on certain topics, but rather giving companies space and recognizing and giving kudos to companies for actually just explaining why they are and aren't looking at certain aspects of water. And so certainly from my perspective, investors who are asking companies, not just are you disclosing on water, but like, are you looking at and how are you prioritizing and identifying these impacts, and have you got plans to sort of mitigate these impacts, are sort of certainly far more kind of powerful kind of questions in terms of helping to lead companies to channeling those resources into those areas of that are most strategic for the company, but also for nature from my perspective. So I want to kind of draw us to a close here. So I want to just thank Sarah and John for their time today. Not only the support they've given in producing that paper that we talked through, but also the time for today. Thank you all for attending. I know for some of you it's quite late, but yeah, just want to draw a close to this session, and thank you all for attending. And yeah, please feel free to kind of look any of us up on LinkedIn, and more than happy to connect. So thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hello, I'm Oliver Hurry and I'm here at Graceland, Memphis, Tennessee. I'm all shook up for World Sustainable Procurement Day. Very, very excited indeed. Looking forward to it. For those with suspicious minds, don't worry. It is a wonderful 24 hours of content and knowledge and insight for procurement by procurement. For all those speakers and supporters that are helping us, you're always on my mind, and thanks so much for all your efforts and support. We think it's now or never for us to protect people, planet, and support the procurement profession to lead the way. And of course, we must always think about having a little less conversation and a little bit more action, please. Thank you very much.